You've just finished a long day's work. Your forehead shines with sweat under the evening summer sun, and the doldrums of life weighs heavy on your weary shoulders. As you walk down the grand avenues of Baron Haussmann's new Paris, you spot an advertisement full of color and of promise. A promise of simple pleasures such as bathing, boating, dancing and dining, all under the slow rhythm of nature. Could this perhaps be the Garden of Eden, you think to yourself? No, not in the least. It's talking about La Grenouillère, an entertainment spot along the Seine on the outskirts of Paris. A place with enough sin and immorality to rival that of Sodom and Gomorrah. A place taken straight out of a realist novel that would shock and disgust its readers. Guy de Maupassant actually wrote a short story about the place in 1881, and in which he describes the kind of crowd you'd find there. A mixture of counter-jumpers, of strolling players, of the lowest journalists, of gentlemen in tutelage, of rotten stock jobbers, of ill-famed debauchees, of used-up old, fast men, a doubtful crowd of suspicious characters, half known, half gone under, half recognized, half cut, pickpockets, rogues, procurers of women, sharpers with dignified manners. Claude Monet and Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what was it that brought them together? Their early years had quite a lot of similarities. They were born just a year apart during the reign of Louis Philippe and the July monarchy. They both initiated their artistic careers at a young age, and they both had great ambitions. Monet grew up on the coast of Normandy, where he drew and sold caricatures of the locals. Renoir, meanwhile, spent his childhood years in Paris, where he at the age of 13 started to work in a factory as a painter of porcelain. Both were immensely skilled at their respective crafts and earned enough money to finally start pursuing a proper career in art. And this is where their paths would converge, in a private art school led by the academic painter Charles Gleyre. There they both developed a disdain for the live model and the contrived poses they were supposed to copy. Gleyre was one of the more liberal teachers at the time, but his schooling and his style was still firmly based in the academic method. Monet and Renoir found a fellow skeptic among the classmates there, Frédéric Bazille, whom they both befriended. This triumvirate would continue to work together outside of Gleyre's studio. In 1865, all three took a trip to the Fontainebleau forest where they sought to capture nature as they saw it, then and there. The trip to La Grenouillère 3 years later did however not include Bazille. It was Monet and Renoir who had the idea to take the train to the outskirts of Paris, to this infamous bathing spot. Not with the intent to take part in the merriment and debauchery. Well, that might have happened too. But their goal was instead to immortalize it, like a camera, to take a snapshot of the moment. Several paintings were created during this visit, but we will focus on the famous duo that depict the so-called flower pot and its surroundings. A view that was almost exactly described by Maupassant in the same short story as mentioned earlier. The immense raft, sheltered by a tarpaulin roof, is attached to the charming island of Croissy by 2 narrow footbridges, one of which leads into the center of this aquatic establishment, while the other unites its end with a tiny islet planted with a tree and surnamed the flower pot, and thence leads to land near the bath office. I wonder if he saw these paintings and became inspired by them, or if it is just a coincidence. Well, anyway, let's take a brief glance at the two artworks. What are the similarities? What are the differences? It's obviously the same subject, seen from roughly the same angle. However, I would hesitate to say that they were painted during the same time of day. In fact, it looks like the Monet version hints at an early evening, with the golden sun hitting the trees in the background, whereas Renoir's version tells a story of a somewhat more overcast noon, with a more hazy atmosphere. Impressionism is all about light effects, and about recreating the subtleties of different light conditions. To really see how they did this, we can look at the color values by turning the images black and white. Now they are more like drawings, where everything we see is light and shadows. To create this sunset effect, Monet uses strong contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. We see it in the ripples on the water, as well as the leaves against the sky. Renoir instead employs a more concentrated palette. Sure, there are some stronger darks, but his lights are nowhere near as bright. And you can see how a few of the people almost disappear when removing the colors because they share the same value as the background. Speaking of people, that is another difference between them. There's no doubt that these are impressionist works and therefore not very detailed. Yet Renoir still found the need to include some identifiable features of the crowd, most notably the clothing. Compared to many of the other impressionists, Renoir still admired the old masters, especially from the Rococo era. And if one uses their imagination, one can see some similarities with the fête galante genre, popularized by Antoine Watteau. In Monet's case, however, there is little to no trace of the past. His curiosity is fully set on the present and of nature. The main characters in his version are not the people, but instead the water and its playful reflections. He saw the world through the eyes of his mentor, Eugène Baudin, who introduced him to plein air painting. And this view, along with his love of water, would follow him all throughout life. In 1865, Émile Zola wrote an article about the recently deceased anarchist writer Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. In it, he explored Proudhon's opinions about the artist's role in society. There, Zola argues against Proudhon's collectivism and instead suggests that the artist should be an individual, one who goes their own way, one who creates from the heart. And there he offers the thought-provoking definition that art is a corner of creation seen through a temperament. Well, can you find a better demonstration of this idea than with these two paintings, who by all means should look the same, yet clearly are the result of two artists with very different temperaments? Now, what happened to that idea of capturing the moment like a camera? Well, if you think about it, the camera isn't necessarily the objective arbiter of truth. Any photographer will tell you that. And really, the Impressionists never tried to compete with photography. Instead, they wanted to take art to a new place, to do things with painting that photography just couldn't do, to make it more personal, more stylized, and more expressive. And this is why Impressionism struggled so much to be taken seriously. The first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 lasted 4 weeks and saw roughly 3,500 visitors, most of whom came with a mindset more akin to snickering schoolchildren than serious art admirers. All the while 400,000 visitors saw that year's state-sponsored Salon exhibition. Nevertheless, the group carried on, fueled by their own conviction that the winds of history would sooner or later catch their sails and bring them both fame and fortune. In total, 8 Impressionist exhibitions were held, with the final one taking place in 1886. By then, a few collectors had started to regularly buy from the Impressionists. Most notably Paul Durand-Ruel, who sold the idea of Impressionism to an American audience that was more open-minded than the European. While the 1880s was a period of financial success for the Impressionists, it was also a period of crisis for many of its practitioners. Camille Pissarro, for example, found inspiration in Georges Seurat's innovative pointillism and completely abandoned Impressionism for several years before triumphantly returning to it at the end of his life. Renoir instead found in Raphael both a revelation and deep doubts about his own skills as an artist, claiming that he knew neither how to paint nor how to draw. This resulted in a sort of homemade classicism, where he exchanged Delacroix for Ingres and colour for line. An unfortunate decision, which he later went back on, but sadly, that spark, that magic glow and the playfulness of the 1870s could not be relit, partly because of his health problems. His rheumatoid arthritis that developed in the 1890s would severely limit his mobility from then on. Despite that, he continued working till the very end, and in his last year alive, in 1919, he visited the Louvre, bound to a wheelchair, admiring the same old masters as when he was young. In these great halls he also saw his own portrait of Madame Charpentier from 1877, and as per his request, it hung right next to his favorite painting, The Wedding at Cana, by Paolo Veronese. Even Monet suffered from depressive episodes caused by pressure to constantly outdo himself, but his response was always to push Impressionism further, colour above all else, and his home in Giverny would become the preeminent laboratory for Impressionist experimentation. In the 1890s, he developed the idea of creating a series of the same subject seen during different times of the day. Haystacks, the Rouen Cathedral, Houses of Parliament in London, more and more delving into the world of total abstraction. The subject itself was no longer of primary concern, nor secondary or even tertiary. Again, colour above all else, which he especially illustrates in his water lilies. Monet also endured health problems. His eyes started to develop cataracts, and his perception of colour would be severely affected. He was likewise deeply affected by the First World War and wanted to contribute in his own way. Therefore, he donated many of the biggest paintings from the Water Lily series to the French state, and these ended up in what we today know as the Musée de l'Orangerie. There Monet envisioned the idea of an oval room, a cathedral of Impressionism, where these enormous canvases would envelop the viewers. This dream was eventually realized, but the grand opening was overshadowed by the absence of its creator. Monet, the last remaining Impressionist, had died just months before in his home in Giverny. Thanks for watching.